This is History in Your Backyard. I'm Arch Astolfi, continuing to bring you visits to historic places in Danvers. Today we are at the Parris Archaeological Site, which is located behind the house at 67 Center Street. Our guest today is Richard Trask, Danvers Town Archivist. Dick had a leading role in the organizing and directing of the actual search and excavation. Well, Dick, here we are in the cellar hole of the house where the witchcraft hysteria began. But this place had been buried for almost 200 years. Tell me, how in the world did you find it?
Well, Arch, back in 1969, I had been kind of interested in the beginning of the witchcraft hysteria, and according to tradition, this area here, which was called the Old Colt Field, was the house of the parsonage of Salem Village. And the fellow who owned this property was Alfred Hutchinson, a local school teacher, and I asked him if it was possible to perhaps try to find where this original parsonage was located. It had been built in 1681 and torn down in 1784, so nothing had been on this site for almost 200 years. Because I didn't know anything about archaeology, I thought it was a good idea to try to find someone who did. And I got in contact with a very well-known New England archaeologist, Roland Wells Robbins, who, among other sites, had done the Saugus Ironworks, and asked him if he would come out to Danvers and see if he could help us locate it. So Mr. Robbins did come out, and he began an association with a number of us in Danvers for quite a few years. And basically, the area that's now around the cellar hole is how we had it back in 1969. It was fairly level, and what we basically did was begin to dig trenches, peak holes we called them, dug into the ground, and we were looking for anything that was artifactual in nature, something man-made. When we hit an area that wasn't man-made, objects included in the soil, we knew we hit a virgin area. There wasn't anything there. When we did hit an area that did have, say, brick fragments, pieces of glass, things of that type, we knew that we hit an area that had been disturbed by human people. So all we did basically was take an area that was not disturbed, dig another area that wasn't disturbed, dig another area that was disturbed, and then we would take that disturbed area and the non-disturbed area and continue to dig in until we hit a foundation. And that's basically what we did. We hit a foundation.
And that took how long?
We were working part-time on weekends for about 2.5, 3 months before we really hit the pay dirt.
Well, that must have been an exciting time when you did that, huh? Well, Dick, can you give us a little historical background on the house and also the other ministers who lived here besides the Reverend Samuel Parris?
Sure. We're actually standing in what doesn't look like an awful lot now, just a simple cellar hole. But in American history, this is probably one of the most significant sites in colonial American history. This structure that was originally here was built in 1681 by the inhabitants of Salem Village as a parsonage for the minister. It was actually kind of built as an enticement to get some ministers to come and live in Salem Village. Now, the first minister who was here, who actually inhabited this property, was a fellow by the name of George Burroughs. And Burroughs remained here for only a few years. He had a lot of controversy with some of the members of his parish and eventually left for the Maine area. And in 1692, George Burroughs was accused of practicing witchcraft, and as a matter of fact, one of the accusers of him, a little 12-year-old girl named Ann Putnam, indicated that Burroughs's first wife had come to her wrapped in a burial shroud and indicating that George had actually killed her where we're now standing. Wow. And this was some of the evidence used in his trial. Burroughs was subsequently found guilty and hanged in August of 1692 for practicing witchcraft. So the first minister here was actually hanged as a witch. Wow. Next minister was a guy named Deodat Lawson, and Lawson is remembered during the witchcraft hysteria because he came back to his former parish and he wrote one of the first accounts of the witchcraft hysteria, called A Brief and True Narrative. And he records visiting here in early March of 1692, and just about in this space where we are right now, watching some of the girls go into their hysterics and throwing firebrands, pieces of burning embers, throughout the building. The minister who's probably most known to the witchcraft era is Reverend Samuel Parris, and he came here in 1688. And in his homestead, he had living a very sickly wife, Elizabeth, a daughter, Elizabeth, a niece who was also a maidservant living in the homestead, named Abigail Williams, and he owned 2 slaves. And one of the slaves was called, we think the pronunciation is Tituba, or Tituba. And it was in this area in 1692, in the early winter months of that year, that according to tradition, Tituba started telling the girls in the household and other neighborhood children stories of witchcraft, which somehow got them to begin to go into hysteric fits and resulted about 8 months later in the deaths of some 23 people. Once Parris was forced out of Salem Village, another minister came here. His name was Joseph Green, only a 22-year-old new minister, newly graduated from Harvard, and he's most well known because he kept a diary. Today we don't associate ministers with having other occupations, but Green was not only a minister but also a farmer, and his diary of what happened here during his stay is a significant document in colonial history. Later on, another minister by the name of Clark lived here, and he's most noted for being a great theologian in the colonial sense, and a lot of his books and sermons were published. And then finally, Benjamin Wadsworth lived here. And Wadsworth was the minister during the Revolutionary era, and it was from this house that Wadsworth shouldered his musket and went to the famous Salem alarm in February of 1775, just before the Lexington and Concord clash. Now, Wadsworth lived here. The house was considered dilapidated by the time he was here, and in 1785 he bought himself a new parcel and moved to a new house that he had constructed, and this structure was torn down. And I'm not sure if the camera can see it, but just behind us in the back is a large yellow house which Wadsworth eventually moved to, and this site was filled in after that.
Now, these cellar holes were only on part of the house. What about the remainder of the layout?
Okay, well, the house as originally built was 40 feet long by about 20 feet wide. And traditionally in the 17th century, you usually had a cellar hole under one section of the house, and that's what's behind us now. The rest of the house, however, came over this way towards camera, and the area that we're really basically standing in right now, we're standing in the chimney structure. The house would normally face in a southerly direction for best exposure to the sun, and 1/2 cellar, and the cellar would be used primarily for storage of commodities and things of that type. Then the 1681 cellar and the 1681 house had an addition in 1734, and that's the one that's really in our immediate back area over in that section. And that was known as the study, and that dated 1734 and was used by the minister for preparation of sermons and things of that type.
Now, how about this over here?
Yeah, why don't we take a walk over here and take a look at this. We're still in what was originally the house site, and although it's probably kind of hard to pick up right now, we do have peace stones that surround the rest of the site to see what the original bulk of the house was like. This little foundation behind us here now is very shallow, and we discovered that actually it was on Halloween in 1970, and when we discovered it, we found that some of the best artifacts actually came from this site here. And we found a small cache of coins, all half-pennies dating from the 1680s to about the 1750s, and some of our best artifacts. All we can assume at this point is that this is just a small foundation to what was originally the salt box or shed area to the rear of the house, which would have extended all of the way across. But this little area in here, apparently, once the shed was torn down to build the 1734 addition, they used this as a refuse pit to throw their garbage and so forth, and that's why we had so many very good artifacts stored here.
Now, probably the most interesting part. What did you find here, and what do these artifacts tell us about the life and culture of Americans of colonial times?
Well, in our excavation, we found well over 30,000 artifacts. Now, the majority of the artifacts are probably no bigger than about a 50-cent piece, but a good archaeologist with some basic information can tell a lot by objects even that fragmented. Because this was an archaeological site, most of the material we found was broken before it was thrown away. So that's why we very seldom find anything in its original wholeness. But just as an example of some of the objects we found, this is a very nice, approximately 1690 stoneware jug. Has some nice cobalt blue colorations in it. It would have held in it either beer or hard cider, probably had a pewter top on it. And this particular fragment, if you take a real careful look at it, it's made up of probably 15 or 20 individual shards that had to be matched and cross-matched so we could get something that looked this good.
You put it together.
Right. And this is a very nice, exquisite type of ware that would have been imported from the Germanic countries, the kind of thing that only the upper class type of people would have used. A much more utilitarian ware is this type of thing, which is, call it redware, pottery, clay, call it what you want. This is the type of thing that was used in everyday service for food preparation and eating in a homestead. And this particular platter probably was used in the household sometime in the early 1700s. It has a glazing on the front of it, this shiny area, and you notice the back of it is unglazed, very utilitarian. You can also see that with about 2/3 of the platter in existence, this is also made up of a number of different shards. It also has on it a yellow slip decoration to just give it a little nicer quality for use within the house. And this is what most people would have eaten off of in the 17th, 18th century. The other small object I brought with me today is just a common tablespoon. This was originally brass. It looks more like our soup spoon of today, but this is the tablespoon used of the 17th, early 18th century. This, your knife, and your fingers were your chief eating accoutrements in the 17th and 18th century. The fork was virtually unknown as an instrument for eating when you're talking about the 17th century. And this particular one is a good example of a probably 1650, 1660 style spoon.
Thank you very much, Richard Trask, Danvers Town Archivist. Today we have literally found history in our backyard at 67 Center Street. A fascinating adventure in Salem Village, now Danvers Highlands, where the witchcraft hysteria began. This site is open to the public. You can visit it at any time. Again, it is located at the rear of the house at 67 Center Street. There is a convenient pathway to the right of the property which leads to the site. Of particular interest to us at this time is the fact that at the Danvers annual town meeting, which will be held in May, a warrant article proposes providing the funds to purchase this property, thus for the town of Danvers, thus guaranteeing that it will not remain in private ownership and thus have the possibility of being destroyed. If you would like a copy of an article from Yankee Magazine written by Richard Trask, which gives a more complete story about the Parris Archaeological dig, send your name and address to the Nashoba address, which will be given at the end of the program. or call 777-8750. That's 777-8750. I'm Arch Astolfi for Danvers Diary.